Once a functioning social order is firmly established, an individual who must find a relatively isolated place within it in order to survive will tend to think its thoughts, adopt its assumptions about the inevitability of certain forms of authority, and in general adapt to its ends. The costs of an alternative path or a challenge to power are high, the resources are lacking, and the prospects limited. These factors operate in slave and feudal societies, where their efficacy has duly impressed counterinsurgency theorists. In free societies, they manifest themselves in other ways. If their power to shape behavior begins to erode, other means must be sought to tame the rascal multitude. When force is on the side of the masters, they may rely on relatively crude means of manufacture of consent and need not overly concern themselves with the minds of the herd. Nevertheless, even a violent terror state faces David Hume's problem. The modalities of state terrorism that the United States has devised for its clients have commonly included at least a gesture towards winning hearts and minds, though experts warn against undue sentimentality, arguing that all the dilemmas are practical and as neutral in an ethical sense as the laws of physics. Nazi Germany shared these concerns, as Albert Speer discusses in his autobiography, and the same is true of Stalinist Russia. Discussing the case of Stalinist Russia, Alexander Gershkonkran observes, "Whatever the strength of the army and the ubiquitousness of the secret police which such a government may have at its disposal, it would be naive to believe that these instruments of physical oppression can suffice. Such a government can maintain itself in power only if it succeeds in making people believe that it performs an important social function which cannot be discharged in its absence. Industrialization provided such a function for the Soviet government, which did what no government relying on the consent of the governed could have done. But paradoxical as it may sound, these policies at the same time have secured some broad acquiescence on the part of the people. If all the forces of the population can be kept engaged in the processes of industrialization, and if this industrialization can be justified by the promise of happiness and abundance for future generations, and much more importantly, by the menace of military aggression from beyond the borders, the dictatorial government will find its power broadly unchallenged. The thesis gained support from the rapid collapse of the Soviet system, when its incapacity to move to a more advanced stage of industrial and technological development became evident. It is important to be aware of the profound commitment of Western opinion to the repression of freedom and democracy by violence if necessary. To understand our own cultural world, we must recognize that advocacy of terror is clear, explicit, and principled across the political spectrum. It is superfluous to invoke the thoughts of Jeane Kirkpatrick, George Will, and the like, but little changes as we move to the establishment left, to borrow the term used by foreign policy editor Charles William Maines in an ode to the American crusade to spread the cause of democracy. Consider political commentator Michael Kinsley, who represents the left in mainstream commentary and television debate. When the State Department publicly confirmed U.S. support for terrorist attacks on agricultural cooperatives in Nicaragua, Michael Kinsley wrote that we should not be too quick to condemn this official policy. Such international terrorist operations doubtless cause vast civilian suffering, he conceded, but if they manage to undermine morale and confidence in the government, then they may be perfectly legitimate. The policy is sensible if cost-benefit analysis shows that the amount of blood and misery that will be poured in yields democracy in the conventional sense already discussed. As a spokesman for the establishment left, Kinsley insists that terror must meet the pragmatic criterion. Violence should not be employed for its own sake, merely because we find it amusing. This more humane conception would readily be accepted by Saddam Hussein, Abu Nidal, and the Hezbollah kidnappers, who presumably also consider terror pointless unless it is of value for their ends. These facts help us to situate enlightened Western opinion on the international spectrum. Such reasoned discussion of the justification for terror is not at all unusual, which is why it elicits no reaction in respectable circles, just as there is no word of comment among its left liberal contributors and readers when the New Republic, long considered the beacon of American liberalism, advocates military aid to Latin-style fascists, regardless of how many are murdered, because there are higher American priorities than Salvadoran human rights. Appreciation of the salutary efficacy of terror, to borrow John Quincy Adams' phrase, has been a standard feature of enlightened Western thought. It provides the basic framework for the propaganda campaign concerning international terrorism in the 1980s. Naturally, terrorism directed against us and our friends is bitterly denounced as a reversion to barbarism. But far more extreme terrorism that we and our agents conduct is considered constructive, or at least insignificant if it meets the pragmatic criterion. Even the vast campaign of international terrorism launched against Cuba by the Kennedy administration, far exceeding anything attributed to official enemies, does not exist in respected academic discourse or the mainstream media. In his standard and much respected scholarly study of international terrorism, Walter LaCure depicts Cuba as a sponsor of the crime with innuendos, but scarcely a pretense of evidence, while the campaign of international terrorism against Cuba merits literally not a word. In fact, Cuba is classed among those societies free from terror. Latin Americanist Robert Wasson of the Hoover Institute writes that after the Bay of Pigs, when the terror mounted to its peak, only non-violent measures were taken against Cuban communism, namely diplomatic and commercial isolation, economic warfare. The guiding principle is clear and straightforward. Their terror is terror, and the flimsiest evidence suffices to denounce it and to exact retribution upon civilian bystanders who happen to be in the way. Our terror, even if far more extreme, is merely statecraft and therefore does not enter into the discussion of the plague of the modern age. The practice is understandable on the principles already discussed. Sometimes the adaptability of the system might surprise even the most hardened observer. Nothing outraged U.S. opinion more than the shooting down of KAL 007 in September 1983 by the Soviet Air Force. The densely printed New York Times Index devoted 7 full pages to the atrocity in that month alone. It did not go entirely unnoticed that the reaction was rather different when the U.S. warship Vincennes shot down an Iranian civilian airliner in a commercial corridor off the coast of Iran, out of a need to prove the viability of Aegis, its high-tech missile system. In the judgment of U.S. Navy Commander David Carlson, who wondered aloud in disbelief as he monitored the events from a nearby naval vessel. This was dismissed as an unfortunate error in difficult circumstances for which the Iranians were ultimately at fault. The last act in this instructive drama took place in April 1990, when the commander of the Vincennes, along with the officer in charge of anti-air warfare, was given the Legion of Merit Award for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding service, and for the calm and professional atmosphere under his command during the period of the destruction of the Iranian Airbus, with 290 people killed. The tragedy isn't mentioned in the text of the citations, Associated Press reported. The media apparently found nothing worthy of comment in any of this, though Iranian condemnations of the destruction of the airliner are occasionally noted and dismissed with derision as boilerplate attacks on the United States. One may imagine the reaction were Iran to go on from boilerplate attacks on the United States to threats to retaliate with military strikes against U.S. targets, perhaps taking its cue from a lead story in the Boston Globe by Yossi Melman and Dan Raviv on how to deal with Saddam Hussein. A strategic strike at their oil fields or an air base might be in order, especially after U.S. intelligence picked up signs that the Iraqi president rewarded the Air Force pilot who mistakenly attacked the USS Stark during the Gulf War. Western readers would be hard put to learn of the Legion of Merit Award to the commander of the Vincennes. But it did not go unnoticed in the Third World, where commentators also readily draw the conclusions barred within Western intellectual culture. Commenting on U.S. imperial policy, Third World resurgence, Malaysia lists the shooting down of the Iranian Airbus among acts of U.S. terrorism in the Middle East, quoting the words of the award and adding that the Western public, fed on the media, sees the situation in black and white, one-dimensional terms, unable to perceive what is obvious to those who escape the grip of the Western propaganda system. Huge massacres are treated by much the same criteria. Their terror and violence are crimes. Our terror and violence are statecraft or understandable error. In a study of U.S. power and ideology a decade ago, Edward Herman and I reviewed numerous examples of two kinds of atrocities: benign and constructive bloodbaths that are acceptable or even advantageous to dominant interests, and nefarious bloodbaths perpetrated by official enemies. The reaction follows the same pattern as the treatment of terrorism. The former, benign and constructive bloodbaths, are ignored, denied, or sometimes even welcomed. The latter, nefarious bloodbaths perpetrated by official enemies elicit great outrage and often large scale deceit and fabrication if the available evidence is felt to be inadequate for doctrinal requirements. One comparison that we presented in great detail was particularly illuminating. The benign bloodbath conducted by Indonesia after its invasion of East Timor in 1975, and the nefarious bloodbath, the Khmer Rouge, when they took over Cambodia in the same year. Reviewing virtually all available material, at that time covering primarily 1975 to 1977, we showed that the evidence concerning these two horrendous bloodbaths in the same part of the world in the same years was comparable and indicated that the two slaughters were comparable in scale and character. There are also differences. One was that the Indonesian aggression and bloodbath in East Timor received critical material and diplomatic support from the United States and its allies, and could have readily been terminated by exposure and withdrawal of this support, while no one offered a serious proposal as to how to mitigate the Pol Pot atrocities. For that reason, the Timor bloodbath was far more significant for the West, at least if elementary moral standards are applicable. A second difference lay in the reaction to the two bloodbaths. Following the pattern illustrated throughout the record that we surveyed, the East Timor atrocities and the crucial contribution of the U.S. and its allies were suppressed or denied. The media even avoided refugee testimony, exactly as in the case of the U.S. terror bombing of Cambodia a few years earlier. In the parallel case of the Khmer Rouge, in contrast, we documented a record of deceit that would have impressed Stalin, including massive fabrication of evidence, suppression of useless evidence, for example, the conclusions of State Department Cambodia watchers, the most knowledgeable source, but considered too restrained to serve the purposes at hand, and so forth. The reaction to the exposure is also instructive. On the Timor half of the comparison, further silence, denial, and apologetics. On the Cambodia half, a great chorus of protests claiming that we were denying or downplaying Pol Pot atrocities. This was a transparent falsehood, though admittedly the distinction between advocating that one try to keep to the truth and downplaying the atrocities of the official enemy is a difficult one for the mind of the commissar, who, furthermore, is naturally infuriated by any challenge to the right to lie in the service of the state, particularly when it is accompanied by a demonstration of the services rendered to ongoing atrocities. Quite generally, wholesale slaughter is regarded benignly, and the revelation of direct U.S. government participation in it arouses no particular interest when the means are well suited to our ends. And it is reasonable enough to regard the dilemmas of counterinsurgency as merely practical and ethically neutral. It is simply a matter of finding the proper mix among the various techniques of population control, ranging in practice from B-52 bombing in napalm to torture and mutilation and disappearance, and to kinder, gentler means such as starvation and totalitarian control in concentration camps called strategic hamlets or model villages. Leading theorists of this form of international terrorism calmly explain that while it is a desirable goal to win popular allegiance to the government we back or impose, that is a distinctly secondary consideration and does not provide an appropriate conceptual framework for counterinsurgency programs. The unifying theme should be influencing behavior rather than attitudes. Charles Wolfe, senior correspondent and economist of the Rand Corporation. David Hume's problem then does not arise. There need be no concern that force is on the side of the governed. For influencing behavior, such techniques as confiscation of chickens, razing of houses, or destruction of villages are quite proper as long as harshness meted out by government forces is unambiguously recognizable as deliberately imposed because of behavior by the population that contributes to the insurgent movement. If it is not, terror will be a meaningless exercise. The crucial point, this respected scholar continues, is to connect all programs with the kind of population behavior the government wants to promote. Charles Wolfe notes a further advantage of this more scientific approach, emphasizing control of behavior rather than attitudes. It should improve the image of counterinsurgency in the United States. We are, after all, an enlightened society that respects science and technology and has little use for mystical rumination on minds and attitudes. Note that when we turn the United States, where coercive force is not readily available, we must concern ourselves with control of attitudes and opinions. Even imposing mass starvation is entirely legitimate if it meets the pragmatic criterion, as explained by Professor David Rowe, Director of Graduate Studies in International Relations at Yale University. Testifying in Congress before China became a valued ally, Professor David Rowe advised that the U.S. should purchase all surplus Canadian and Australian wheat so as to impose general starvation on 1 billion people in China, a cost-effective method, he observed, to undermine the internal stability of that country. As an expert on the Asian mind, he assured Congress that this policy would be particularly welcomed by the Japanese because they've had a demonstration of the tremendous power and action of the United States and have felt our power directly in the firebombing of Tokyo and at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It would therefore alarm the Japanese people very intensely and shake the degree of their friendly relations with us if we seemed unwilling to use the power they know we have in Vietnam and China. Apart from the scale of his vision, Professor David Rowe was following a well-trodden path. As the director of the humanitarian program providing food to starving Europeans after World War I, Herbert Hoover advised President Wilson that he was maintaining a thin line of food to guarantee the rule of anti-Bolshevik elements. In response to rumors of a serious outbreak on May Day in Austria, Hoover issued a public warning that any such action would jeopardize the city's sparse food supply. Food was withheld from Hungary under the communist Bela Kun government with a promise that it would be supplied if he were removed in favor of a government acceptable to the United States. The economic blockade, along with Romanian military pressure, forced the communist Bela Kun to relinquish power and flee to Moscow. Backed by French and British forces, the Romanian military joined with Hungarian counter-revolutionaries to administer a dose of white terror and install a right-wing dictatorship under Admiral Horthy, who collaborated with Hitler in the next stage of slaying the Bolshevik beast. The threat of starvation was also used to buy the critical Italian elections of 1948 and to help impose the rule of U.S. clients in Nicaragua in 1990, among other noteworthy examples. Dikes were bombed in South Vietnam to eliminate the supply of food for South Vietnamese peasants resisting U.S. aggression, and crop destruction was carried out throughout Indochina, as in Central America in recent years. The practice can be traced to the earliest Indian wars, and of course was no innovation of the British colonialists. A review of the debate over Central America during the past decade reveals the decisive role of the pragmatic criterion. Guatemala was never an issue because mass slaughter and repression appeared to be effective. Early on, the church was something of a problem, but as Kenneth Freed comments in the Los Angeles Times, when 14 priests and hundreds of church workers were killed in a military campaign to destroy church support for social gains as higher wages and an end to the exploitation of Indians, the church was intimidated and virtually fell silent. The physical intimidation eased, the pragmatic criterion having been satisfied. Terror increased again as the U.S. nurtured what it likes to call democracy. The victims, a European diplomat observes, are almost always people whose views or activities are aimed at helping others to free themselves of restraints placed by those who hold political or economic power, such as a doctor who tries to improve the health of babies, and is therefore seen as attacking the established order. The security forces of the fledgling democracy and the death squads associated with them appeared to have the situation reasonably well in hand, so there was no reason for undue concern in the United States, and there has been virtually none. There was some media notice of the atrocious human rights record in Guatemala as Washington moved to discredit President Cerezo and his Christian Democrats, in a policy shift towards more right-wing elements. The proper lessons still had to be taught, however. Thus, Freed stresses Washington's repugnance at the extraordinary human rights violations of the security forces that it supports. And in the New York Times, Lindsay Gruson reports that Washington is increasing its dependence on the Guatemalan army, which is the source of the abuses, including Guatemalan military intelligence, G2, notorious for its leading role in state terror. But he assures the reader that human rights issues rank high among American policy goals for Guatemala, a doctrinal truth resistant to mere fact. Kenneth Fried adds that General Hector Gramajo was a senior commander in the early 1980s when the Guatemalan military was blamed for the deaths of tens of thousands of people, largely civilians. But he continues, Gramajo is seen as a moderate by the U.S. Embassy, the familiar pattern. Kenneth Fried quotes a Western diplomat who doubts that Gramajo himself is promoting all these killings by death squads linked to the security forces. Though whenever he senses that the left is trying to organize, he permits, if not orders, hard action against them, and certainly doesn't root out any offenders. El Salvador and Nicaragua also illustrate the pragmatic criterion. The media pretended not to know that the government of El Salvador was conducting mass slaughter from 1979 and concealed the worst atrocities. By the early 1980s, it appeared that the U.S. might be drawn into an intervention harmful to its interests. Accordingly, concern increased, and there were even a few months of fairly honest reporting. But as the terror appeared to be achieving its goals, thanks to U.S. guidance and support, qualms dissipated in favor of the celebration of democracy, while the government continued its programs of terror and intimidation. Nicaragua was an object of contention because terror and economic warfare were achieving only limited success. But these were the only concerns, as was made crystal clear when the population finally followed U.S. orders after a decade of terror and destruction in a country already ravaged by Somoza's murderous assault and robbery, leaving all right-thinking people united in joy. Throughout this grim decade of savagery and oppression, liberal humanists have presented themselves as critical of the terror states maintained by the United States violence in Central America. But that is only a facade, as we see from the demand, virtually unanimous in respectable circles, that Nicaragua must be restored to the Central American mode of the death squad regimes, and that the U.S. and its murderous clients must impose the regional standards of El Salvador and Guatemala on Nicaragua's errant Sandinistas. A closer look establishes more firmly the prevailing norms. The record reveals near unanimous opposition to the Sandinistas, with only tactical disagreement as to how they should be overthrown, and sharp distinction to the gangster states that already meet the regional standards. Unmentioned in hundreds of columns sampled in the national press is the fact that, unlike the regimes favored by the liberal doves in the United States, the Sandinistas, whatever their sins, did not engage in mass slaughter, terror, and torture, such matters of near zero significance to enlightened Western opinion, as this record reveals. Correspondingly, there is agreement that one military force that must be dismantled is the one that does not regularly engage in mass terror against the civilian population. As Edward Herman observed, just as there are worthy and unworthy victims, the worthy victims being those persecuted by official enemies who arouse great anguish, the unworthy victims being our victims, whose fate is a matter of indifference, so there are worthy and unworthy armies. Worthy armies, such as those of Somoza, El Salvador, Guatemala, Indonesia, and others like them, need no interference because they are doing their job. They kill and torture for us, the United States. The unworthy armies do not meet these high standards, even daring to protect their populations from the killers we dispatch. They must therefore be replaced by a force more congenial to our needs and moral values. All of this is so commonplace as to pass without notice. Also, virtually unmentioned in hundreds of opinion columns on Nicaragua are the programs of social welfare and reform, considered remarkably successful by international agencies until the U.S. was able to reverse the unwelcome progress by the mid 1980s. Strikingly, after the U.S. victory in the 1990 elections in Nicaragua, it was suddenly permitted to take note of these facts, now that the threat to wealth and power had been removed. Throughout, the priorities of enlightened opinion shine through bright and clear. Returning to David Hume's principles of government, it is clear that they must be refined. True, when force is lacking and the standard penalties do not suffice, it is necessary to resort to the manufacture of consent. The populations of the Western democracies, or at least those in a position to defend themselves, are off limits. Others are legitimate objects of repression, and in the third world, large-scale terror is appropriate, though the liberal conscience adds the qualification that it must be efficacious. The statesman, as distinct from the ideological fanatic, will understand that the means of violence should be employed in a measured and considered way, just sufficient to achieve the desired ends. The pragmatic criterion dictates that violence is in order only when the rascal multitude cannot be controlled in other ways. Often there are other ways. Another Rand Corporation counterinsurgency specialist was impressed by the relative docility of poorer peasants and the firm authority of landlords in the more feudal areas, where the landlord can exercise considerable influence over his tenants' behavior and readily discourage conduct inconsistent with his own interests. It is only when the docility is shaken, perhaps by meddlesome priests, that firmer measures are required. One option short of outright violence is legal repression. In Costa Rica, the United States was willing to tolerate social democracy. The primary reason for the benign neglect was that labor was suppressed and the rights of investors were offered every protection. The founder of Costa Rican democracy, Jose Figueres, was an avid partisan of U.S. corporations and the CIA, and was regarded by the State Department as the best advertising agency that the United Fruit Company could find in Latin America. But the leading figure of Central American democracy fell out of favor in the 1980s and had to be censored completely out of the free press because of his critical attitude towards the U.S. war against Nicaragua and Washington's moves to restore Costa Rica as well to the preferred Central American mode. Even the elusive editorial and lengthy obituary in the New York Times lauding this fighter for democracy when he died in June 1990 were careful to avoid these inconvenient deviations. In earlier years, when he was better behaved, Jose Figueres recognized that the Costa Rican Communist Party, particularly strong among plantation workers, was posing an unacceptable challenge. He therefore arrested its leaders, declared the party illegal, and repressed its members. The policy was maintained through the 1960s, while efforts to establish any working class party were banned by the state authorities. Jose Figueres explained these actions with candor. It was a sign of weakness, I admit it, when one is relatively weak before the force of the enemy. It is necessary to have the valor to recognize it. These moves were accepted in the West as consistent with the liberal concept of democracy, and indeed were virtually a precondition for U.S. toleration of the Costa Rican exception. Sometimes, however, legal repression is not enough. The popular enemy is too powerful. The alarm bells are sure to ring if they threaten the control of the political system by the business landowner elite and military elements properly respectful of U.S. interests. Signs of such deviation call for stronger measures. Such was the case in El Salvador. After the harsh repression of nonviolent activities, the masses were with the guerrillas by early 1980 in the judgment of Jose Napoleon Duarte, the U.S. imposed figurehead. To bar the threat of nationalism responsive to popular demands and pressures, it was therefore necessary to resort to a war of extermination and genocide against a defenseless civilian population, to borrow the terms of Archbishop Oscar Romero's successor a few months after the assassination. Meanwhile, Jose Napoleon Duarte praised the army for its valiant service alongside the people against subversion as he was sworn in as civilian president of the military junta to provide a cover for active U.S. engagement in the slaughter, and thus to become a respected figure in Western circles. The broader framework was sketched by Father Ignacio Martin Barro, one of the Jesuit priests assassinated in November 1989, and a noted Salvadoran social psychologist, in a talk he delivered in California on the psychological consequences of political terrorism a few months before he was murdered. Father Ignacio Martin Barro stressed several relevant points. First, the most significant form of terrorism, by a large measure, is state terrorism. That is, terrorizing the whole population through systematic actions carried out by the forces of the state. Second, such terrorism is an essential part of a government-imposed socio-political project designed for the needs of the privileged. To implement it, the whole population must be terrorized by an internalized fear. Father Ignacio Martin Barro only alludes to a third point, which is the most important one for a Western audience. The socio-political project and the state terrorism that helps to implement it are not specific to El Salvador, but are common features
of the third world domains of the United States for reasons deeply rooted in Western culture, institutions, and policy planning, and fully in accord with the values of enlightened opinion. These crucial factors explain much more than the fate of El Salvador. In the same talk, Father Ignacio Martin Barro referred to the massive campaign of political terrorism in El Salvador a decade ago, conducted with U.S. backing and initiative. He noted further that since 1984, with the coming of so-called democratic government in El Salvador under Jose Napoleon Duarte, things seemed to change a bit. But in reality, things did not change. What changed was that the terrorized population was reduced to only two options: to go to the mountains and join the ranks of the rebels, or to comply, at least openly, with the programs imposed by the government. The killings then reduced in scale, a development that occasioned much self-praise here for our benign influence. The reason for the decline, he observes, is that there was less need for extraordinary events because people were so terrorized, so paralyzed. The objective remained the same: eliminating all significant opposition and protest. The dirty war has at no time stopped being an essential ingredient in the socio-political project that the United States is trying to achieve in El Salvador, even after formal democracy was introduced to legitimize the war in Western eyes. These methods succeeded in the dismantling of the popular mass organizations, as the very existence of organizations unsympathetic to the government became impossible, and those militants who were not exterminated had to flee to the countryside, or to go underground, or choked with terror abandon the struggle. By weakening the support bases of the revolutionary movement in all sectors of the population, there is no doubt that the dirty war was successful. A macabre success, to be sure, but successful none the less. Throughout the decade and well after democracy was established, the Salvadoran Church and human rights groups continued to describe how the security forces of the fledgling democracy, with the full knowledge and cooperation of their U.S. sponsors, imposed upon Salvadoran society a regime of terror and panic, a result of the persistent violation of basic human rights, marked by collective intimidation and generalized fear on the one hand, and on the other, the internalized acceptance of the terror because of the daily and frequent use of violent means. In general, society accepts the frequent appearance of tortured bodies because basic rights, the right to life, has absolutely no overriding value for society. Socorro Judicio, December 1985. This last comment also applies to the supervisors, as underscored by Secretary of State George Shultz a few months later in one of his lamentations on terrorism, a talk delivered just as the United States was carrying out the terror bombing of Libya, killing many civilians to much applause at home. In El Salvador, Secretary of State George Shultz declared, "The results are something all Americans can be proud of." at least all Americans who enjoy the sight of tortured bodies, starving children, terror and panic, and generalized fear. In a paper on mass media and public opinion in El Salvador, which he was to have delivered at an international congress in December 1989, the month after he was assassinated, Father Ignacio Martin Barro wrote that the U.S. counterinsurgency project emphasized merely the formal dimensions of democracy, and that the mass media must be understood as a mechanism of psychological warfare. These small independent journals in El Salvador, mainstream and pro business, but still too undisciplined for the rulers, had been taken care of by the security forces a decade earlier in the usual efficacious manner: kidnapping, assassination, and physical destruction, events considered here too insignificant even to report. As for public opinion, Father Ignacio Martin Barrios' unread paper reports a study showing that among workers, the lower middle class, and the poor, less than 20% feel free to express their opinions in public, a figure that rose to 40% for the rich. Another tribute to the salutary efficacy of terror, and another result that all Americans can be proud of. The continuity of U.S. policy is well illustrated by the record of the Atlicado Battalion, whose soldiers professionally obeyed orders from their officers to kill the Jesuit priests in cold blood. America's Watch observed on the 10th anniversary of the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero, proceeding to review some of the achievements of this elite unit, created, trained, and equipped by the United States. The Atlicado Battalion was formed in March 1981 when 15 specialists in counterinsurgency were sent to El Salvador from the U.S. Army School of Special Forces. From the start, the Atlicado Battalion was engaged in the murder of large numbers of civilians. A professor at the U.S. Army School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia, described its soldiers as particularly ferocious. We've always had a hard time getting them to take prisoners instead of ears. In December 1981, the battalion took part in an operation in which hundreds of civilians were killed in an orgy of murder, rape, and burning. Over 1,000, according to the Church Legal Aid Office. Later, it was involved in the bombing of villages and the murder of hundreds of civilians by shooting, drowning, and other methods, the vast majority being women, children, and the elderly. This has been the systematic pattern of special warfare in El Salvador since the first major military operation in May 1980, when 600 civilians were murdered and mutilated at the Rio San Paul in a joint operation of the Salvadoran and Honduran armies, a slaughter revealed by church sources, human rights investigators, and the foreign press, but not the U.S. media, which also have their psychological warfare function. The Lawyers Committee for Human Rights alleged in a letter to Defense Secretary Dick Cheney that the killers of the Jesuits were trained by U.S. Special Forces up to 3 days before the assassinations. Father John de Cortina, Dean of Engineering at the Jesuit University in El Salvador, where the priests were murdered, alleged further that the U.S. military instructors were the same U.S. soldiers who were trapped in a San Salvador hotel a few days later, in a highly publicized incident. In earlier years, some of the Atlacado Battalion's worst massacres occurred when it was fresh from U.S. training. The nature of Salvadoran army training was described by a deserter who received political asylum in Texas in July 1990 after the immigration judge rejected a State Department request that he be denied asylum and sent back to El Salvador. In this fledgling democracy, the wealthy are immune from conscription. Rather, teenagers are rounded up in sweeps and slums and refugee camps. According to this deserter, whose name was withheld by the court for obvious reasons, conscripts were made to kill dogs and vultures by biting their throats and twisting off their heads, and had to watch as soldiers tortured and killed suspected dissidents, tearing out their fingernails, cutting off their heads, cutting a body to pieces as though it was a toy and they played with the arms for entertainment, or starving and torturing them to death. Recruits were told that they would be assigned the same tasks, and that torturing people and animals makes you more of a man and gives you more courage. In another recent case, an admitted member of a Salvadoran death squad associated with the Atlacado Battalion, Cesar Vilman Hoya Martinez, testified on his first-hand experience in state terror, providing detailed information about the murder operations with the complicity of U.S. intelligence advisors and the government to the highest level, including evidence extremely relevant to the murder of the Jesuit priests. Cesar Vilman Hoya Martinez's testimony is corroborated by an associate who also defected in allegations to a Mexican Rights Commission. After an initial pretense that it would investigate Cesar Vilman Hoya Martinez's story, the Bush administration proceeded to make every effort to silence him and ship him back to probable death in El Salvador, despite the pleas of human rights organizations and Congress that he be protected and that his testimony be heard. The treatment of the main witness to the assassination of the Jesuits was similar. It might be noted that the treatment of the murdered Jesuit intellectuals themselves is not really different. Their murder and the judicial inquiry, such as it is, received attention, but not what they had to say. About this, one will find very little, even when it would take no initiative to discover it. For example, the August 1990 conference of the American Psychological Association in Boston had a series of panels and symposia dealing with the work of Father Ignacio Martin Barro, including one in which the videotape of his California talk shortly before his assassination was played. The conference was covered by the Boston Globe, but not these sessions. On the day they were held, the Boston Globe preferred a paper on male facial expressions that are attractive to women. First things first, after all. When Antonio Gramsci was imprisoned after the fascist takeover of Italy, the government summed up its case by saying, "We must stop this brain from functioning for 20 years. Our current favorites leave less to chance. The brains must be stopped from functioning forever." And we agree that their thoughts about such matters as state terrorism had best not be heard. The results of U.S. military training are evident in abundance in the documentation by human rights groups and the Salvadoran Church. They are graphically described by Reverend Daniel Santiago, a Catholic priest working in El Salvador, in the Jesuit journal America. Reverend Daniel Santiago reports the story of a peasant woman who returned home one day to find her mother, sister, and 3 children sitting around a table. The decapitated head of each person placed carefully on the table in front of the body, the hands arranged on top, as if each body was stroking its own head. The assassins from the Salvadoran National Guard had found it hard to keep the head of an 18-month-old baby in place, so they nailed the hands onto it. A large plastic bowl filled with blood was tastefully displayed in the center of the table. To take just one further example, striking because of the circumstances, we may turn back to January 1988, when the U.S. completed its demolition of the Central America Peace Accords, exempting its murderous clients from the provisions calling for justice, freedom, and democracy, respect for human rights, and guarantees for the inviolability of all forms of life and liberty. Just as this cynical success was being recorded, the bodies of 2 men and a teenage boy were found at a well-known death squad dumping ground, blindfolded with hands tied behind their backs and signs of torture. The Non-Governmental Human Rights Commission, which continues to function despite the assassination of its founders and directors, reported that 13 bodies had been found in the preceding 2 weeks, most showing signs of torture, including 2 women who had been hanged from a tree by their hair, their breasts cut off, and their faces painted red. The reports were given anonymously in fear of state terror. No one failed to recognize the traditional marks of the death squads. The information was reported by the wire services and prominently published in Canada, but not by the U.S. national press. Reverend Daniel Santiago writes that macabre scenes of the kind he recounts are designed by the armed forces for the purpose of intimidation. People are not just killed by death squads in El Salvador, they are decapitated, and then their heads are placed on pikes and used to dot the landscape. Men are not just disemboweled by the Salvadoran Treasury Police, their severed genitalia are stuffed into their mouths. Salvadoran women are not just raped by the National Guard, their wombs are cut from their bodies and used to cover their faces. It is not enough to kill children. They are dragged over barbed wire until the flesh falls from their bones while parents are forced to watch. The aesthetics of terror in El Salvador is religious. The intention is to ensure that the individual is totally subordinated to the interests of the fatherland, which is why the death squads are sometimes called the Army of National Salvation by the governing Arena Party, whose members, including President Cristiani, take a blood oath to the leader for life, Roberto de Abusin. The armed forces scoop up recruits from the age of 13 and indoctrinate them with rituals adopted from the Nazi SS, including brutalization and rape, so that they are prepared for killing with sexual overtones as a religious rite. The stories of training are not fairy tales. They are punctuated with the hard evidence of corpses, mutilated flesh, splattered brains, and eyewitnesses. This sadomasochistic killing creates terror, and terror creates passivity in the face of oppression. A passive population is easy to control, so that there will be plenty of docile workers and no complaints, and the socio-political project can be pursued with equanimity. Reverend Daniel Santiago reminds us that the current wave of violence is a reaction to attempts by the church to organize the poor in the 1970s. State terror mounted as the church began forming peasant associations and self-help groups, which along with other popular organizations spread like wildfire through Latin American communities. Lars Schultz writes that the United States should turn at once to massive repression with the cooperation of local elites will surprise only those who are willfully ignorant of history. In the U.S. planner's record, Father Ignacio Ellacuria, rector of the Jesuit University before he was assassinated, along with Father Ignacio Martin Barrio, described El Salvador as a lacerated reality, almost mortally wounded. He was a close associate of Archbishop Oscar Romero and was with him when the Archbishop wrote to President Carter, pleading in vain for the withdrawal of aid from the junta. Archbishop Oscar Romero informed Father Ignacio Ellacuria that his letter was prompted by the new concept of special warfare, which constitutes in murderously eliminating every endeavor of the popular organizations under the allegation of communism or terrorism. Special warfare, whether called counterinsurgency or low intensity conflict or some other euphemism, is simply international terrorism, and it has long been official U.S. policy, a weapon in the arsenal used for the larger socio-political project. The same has been true in neighboring Guatemala. Latin American scholar Piero Iglesias writes that in the traditional culture of fear, ferocious repression sufficed to impose peace and order, just as the Indian was branded a savage beast to justify his exploitation, so those who sought social reform were branded communists to justify their persecution. The decade 1944 to 1954 in Guatemala was a unique departure marked by political democracy, the strong communist influence, and the administration of President Jacobo Arbenz, 1951 to 1954, and President Arbenz's agrarian reform, years of spring in the country of eternal tyranny, in the words of a Guatemalan poet. 500,000 people received desperately needed land, and the first time in the country's history that the Indians were offered land rather than being robbed of it. A new wind was stirring the Guatemalan countryside. The culture of fear was loosening its grip over the great masses of the Guatemalan population. In a not unreachable future, it might have faded away, a distant nightmare. The Communist Party leaders were regarded by the U.S. Embassy as the sole exception to venality and ambition. They were very honest, very committed, the only people who were committed to hard work, one U.S. Embassy official commented. This was the tragedy, he added. They were our worst enemies and had to be removed along with the reforms they helped to implement. The nightmare was restored in a coup organized by the CIA with approval from President Eisenhower in 1954, with the cooperation of Guatemalan officers who betrayed their country in fear of the regional superpower. Iglesias concludes, with regular U.S. support, the regime of terror and torture and disappearance has been maintained, peaking in the late 1960s with direct U.S. government participation. As the terror somewhat abated, there was a wave of conscientization, heightening of political awareness, largely under church auspices. It inspired the usual reaction. The army intensified the terror, murdering cooperative leaders, bilingual teachers, community leaders, and grassroots organizers. In fact, following the same script as in El Salvador and Nicaragua, by the early 1980s, the terror reached the level of wholesale massacre in the Indian highlands of Guatemala. The Reagan administration was not merely supportive, but enthusiastic about the achievements of their friends. Recall that the Guatemalan generals are moderates who observe the pragmatic criterion. When Indians who had fled to the mountains to survive drifted back, unable to cope with the harsh conditions and begging forgiveness, the army was generous, Iglesias observes, and no longer murdered the supplicants, except now and then as a reminder. When order was once again restored, the generals accepted U.S. advice and instituted a democratic facade behind which they and their allies in the oligarchy would continue to rule. The same terror that controlled the church also silenced the call for reform. Rare is the Guatemalan who expresses his political beliefs, Iglesias comments. Peasants say that they will not support advocates of a agrarian reform because they don't want any trouble from the army. President Arbenz taught us how to build a house, one told an anthropologist, but not how to make it strong, and at the first wind the house fell on top of us. Democracy in the preferred mode is unlikely to face any popular threat under these conditions. The basic problem of the years of spring under President Arbenz was the success of freedom and democracy. The CIA warned in 1952 that the radical and nationalist policies of the government had gained the support or acquiescence of almost all Guatemalans, a sign of what the CIA was later to call their low level of intellectualism. Worse yet, the government was proceeding to mobilize the hitherto politically inerrant peasantry and to create mass support for the present regime. It was advancing these goals by labor organization, agrarian and other social reform, and the nationalist policies identified with the Guatemalan Revolution of 1944. The revolution had aroused a strong national movement to free Guatemala from the military dictatorship, social backwardness, and economic colonialism which had been the pattern of the past, and inspired the loyalty and conformed to the self-interest of most politically conscious Guatemalans. The government's democratic programs offered the public a means to participate in achieving these goals, which ran directly counter to the interests of the oligarchy and U.S. agribusiness. After affairs had been restored to normal by the CIA coup, a secret State Department intelligence report commented that the democratic leadership that had thankfully been overthrown by the CIA coup had insisted upon the maintenance of an open political system, thus allowing the communists to expand their operations and appeal effectively to various sectors of the population. Neither the military nor self-seeking politicians were able to overcome this deficiency, finally cured by the CIA coup, approved by President Eisenhower. Once again, the U.S. found itself in the familiar stance, politically weak, but militarily and economically strong. Policy choices follow naturally. Has been a constant lament of U.S. government officials that the Latin American countries are insufficiently repressive, too open, too committed to civil liberties, unwilling to impose sufficient constraints on travel and dissemination of information, and in general reluctance to adhere to U.S. social and political standards, thus tolerating conditions in which dissidents can flourish and reach a popular audience. At home, even tiny groups may be subject to severe repression if their potential outreach is perceived to be too great. During the campaign waged by the National Political Police against the Black Panthers, including assassination, instigation of ghetto riots, and a variety of other means, the FBI estimated the hardcore members of the targeted organization at only 800, but added ominously that a recent poll indicates that approximately 25% of the black population has great respect for the Black Panther Party, including 43% of blacks under 21 years of age. The repressive agencies of the state proceeded with a campaign of violence and disruption to ensure that the Panthers did not succeed in organizing as a substantial social or political force, with great success, as the organization was decimated and the remnants proceeded to self-destruct. FBI operations in the same years targeted the entire New Left were motivated by similar concerns. The same internal intelligence document warns that the movement of rebellious youth known as the New Left, involving and influencing a substantial number of college students, is having a serious impact on contemporary society with a potential for serious domestic strife. The New Left has revolutionary aims and an identification with Marxism Leninism. It has attempted to infiltrate and radicalize labor, and after failing to subvert and control the mass media, has established a large network of underground publications which serve the dual purpose of an internal communication network and an external propaganda organ. It thus poses a threat to the civilian sector of our society, which must be contained by the state security apparatus. Freedom is fine, but within limits. In the international arena, tactical choices are bounded narrowly by the fundamental institutional imperatives. Positions along this spectrum are by no means fixed. Thus, Henry Kissinger was a dove with regard to China, where he agreed with Richard Nixon that the hardline policy was unproductive and that other measures could draw China into the US dominated global system. At the same time, he was a hawk with regard to the Middle East, supporting Israel's refusal to accept a full-scale peace treaty offered by Egypt and Jordan in early 1971, and blocking State Department moves towards a diplomatic resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict, establishing a policy that still prevails and explains much of what is happening in that region today. Kissinger's policy was stalemate, no negotiations, only force. Henry Kissinger's successor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, has a record as an extreme hawk, but in the 1990 crisis in the Gulf, he strongly opposed the strategic conception of the administration, joining those who urged reliance on sanctions rather than seeking a victory through the threat or use of military force, with its probable consequences for U.S. interests in the Middle East and beyond. There are many other examples. We can learn a good deal by attention to the range of choices. Keeping just to Latin America, consider the efforts to eliminate the Allende regime in Chile. There were two parallel operations. Track 2, the hardline, aimed at a military coup. This was concealed from Ambassador Edward Corey, a Kennedy liberal, whose task was to implement Track 1, the soft line. In Edward Corey's words, to do all within our power to condemn Chile and the Chileans to utmost deprivation and poverty, a policy designed for a long time to come to accelerate the hard features of a communist society in Chile. The soft line was an extension of the long-term CIA effort to control Chilean democracy. One indication of its level is that in the 1964 election, the CIA spent twice as much per Chilean voter to block Allende as the total spent per voter by both parties in the US elections of the same year. Similarly, in the case of Cuba, the Eisenhower administration planned a direct attack, while Vice President Nixon, keeping to the soft line in the secret discussion of June 1960, expressed his concern that according to a CIA briefing, Cuba's economic situation had not deteriorated significantly since the overthrow of Batista, then urging specific measures to place greater economic pressure on Cuba. To take another informative case, in 1949, the CIA identified two areas of instability in Latin America, Bolivia and Guatemala. And let's remember, instability means the threat of democracy and freedom achieved by a population's popular struggle. The Eisenhower administration pursued the hard line to overthrow capitalist democracy in Guatemala, but chose the soft line with regard to a Bolivian revolution that had the support of the Communist Party and radical tin miners, had led to expropriation, and had even moved towards criminal agitation of the Indians, of the farmers and mines. In a pro-peace conference, a right-wing archbishop warned. The White House concluded that the best plan was to support the least radical elements, expecting that U.S. pressures, including domination of the tin market, would serve to control unwanted developments. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles urged that this would be the best way to contain the communist infection in South America. Following standard policy guidelines, the U.S. took control over the Bolivian military, equipping it with modern armaments and sending hundreds of officers to the School of Coups in Panama and elsewhere. Bolivia was soon subject to U.S. influence and control. By 1953, the National Security Council noted improvement in the climate for private investment, including an agreement permitting a private American firm to exploit 2 petroleum areas. A military coup took place in 1964. A 1980 coup was carried out with the assistance of Klaus Barbie, who had been sent to Bolivia when he could no longer be protected in France, where he had been working under U.S. control to repress the anti-fascist resistance, as he had done under the Nazis. According to a recent UNICEF, United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund study, 1 in 3 Bolivian infants dies in the first year of life, so that Bolivia has the lowest rate of population growth in Latin America, along with the highest birth rate. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Association, FAO, estimates that the average Bolivian consumes 78% of daily minimum calorie and protein requirements, and that more than half of Bolivian children suffer from malnutrition. Of the economically active population, 25% are unemployed, and another 40% work in the informal sector, for example, smuggling and drugs. The situation in Guatemala we have already reviewed. Several points merit attention. First, the consequences of the hard line in Guatemala and the soft line in Bolivia were similar. Second, both policy decisions were successful in their major aim, containing the communist virus, the threat of ultranationalism. Third, both policies are evidently regarded as quite proper, as we can see in the case of Bolivia, by the complete lack of interest in what has happened since, apart from possible costs to the United States through the drug racket. And with regard to Guatemala, by the successful intervention under Kennedy to block a democratic election. The direct U.S. participation in murderous counterinsurgency, international terrorism campaigns under Lyndon Johnson, the continuing supply of arms to Guatemala through the late 1970s, contrary to illusory claims, and the reliance on our Israeli mercenary state to fill any gaps when congressional restrictions finally took effect. The enthusiastic U.S. support for atrocities that go well beyond even the astonishing Guatemalan norm in the 1980s, and the applause for the fledgling democracy that the ruling military now tolerates as a means to extort money from Congress. We may say that these are messy episodes and blundering, which in fact succeeded in its major aims, but nothing more, as reported by Stephen Kinzer. Fourth, the soft line and the hard line were adopted by the same people at the same time, revealing that the issues are tactical, involving no departure from shared principle. All this provides insight into the nature of policy and the political culture in which it is formed. The same methods apply generally as in cases already discussed, and many others like them. The cover story throughout is that the subversion of democracy is undertaken in self-defense against the Soviet threat. We had no choice, as the editor of Foreign Affairs explains. John Lewis Gaddis comes closer to the mark when he observes that the increasing success of communist parties in Western Europe, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and China justifiably aroused suspicion about the Soviet Union's behavior, even though their popularity grew primarily out of their effectiveness as resistance fighters against the Axis. The rascal multitude are the problem, the public enemy, and they have to be brought to heel by other means if democratic processes cannot be properly channeled. David Hume's paradox of government arises only if we suppose that a crucial element of essential human nature is what Mikhail Bakunin called an instinct for freedom. It is the failure to act upon this instinct that David Hume found surprising. The same failure inspired Rousseau's classic lament that people are born free, but are everywhere in chains, seduced by the illusions of the civil society that is created by the rich to guarantee their plunder. Some may adopt this assumption as one of the natural beliefs that guide their conduct and their thought. There have been efforts to ground the instinct for freedom in a substantive theory of human nature. They are not without interest, but they surely come nowhere near establishing the case. Like other tenets of common sense, this belief remains a regulative principle that we adopt or reject on faith. Which choice we make can have large-scale consequences for ourselves and others. Those who adopt the common sense principle that freedom is our natural right and essential need will agree with Bertrand Russell that anarchism is the ultimate ideal to which society should approximate. Structures of hierarchy and domination are fundamentally illegitimate. They can be defended only on grounds of contingent need, an argument that rarely stands up to analysis. As Russell went on to observe 70 years ago, the old bonds of authority have little intrinsic merit. Reasons are needed for people to abandon their rights. And the reasons offered are counterfeit reasons, convincing only to those who have a selfish interest in being convinced. The condition of revolt, Bertrand Russell went on, exists in women towards men, and oppressed nations towards their oppressor, and above all in labor towards capital. It is a state full of danger, as all past history shows, yet also full of hope. Bertrand Russell traced the habit of submission in part to coercive educational practices. His views are reminiscent of the 17th and 18th century thinkers, who held that the mind is not to be filled with knowledge from without like a vessel, but to be kindled and awaked. The growth of knowledge resembles the growth of fruit, however external causes may in some degree cooperate. It is the internal vigor and virtue of the tree that must ripen the juices to their just maturity. Similar conceptions underlie Enlightenment thought on political and intellectual freedom, and on alienated labor, which turns the worker into an instrument for other ends, instead of a human being fulfilling inner needs, a fundamental principle of classical liberal thought, though long forgotten because of its revolutionary implications. These ideas and values retain their power and their pertinence, though they are very remote from realization anywhere. As long as this is so, the libertarian revolutions of the 18th century remain far from consummated, a vision for the future. One might take this natural belief to be confirmed by the fact that, despite all efforts to contain them, the rabble continue to fight for their fundamental human rights. And over time, some libertarian ideals have been partially realized or have even become common coin. Many of the outrageous ideas of the 17th century radical Democrats, for example, seem tame enough today, though other early insights remain beyond our current moral and intellectual reach. The struggle for freedom of speech is an interesting case, and a crucial one, since it lies at the heart of a whole array of freedoms and rights. A central question of the modern era is when, if ever, the state may act to interdict the content of communications. As noted earlier, even those regarded as leading libertarians have adopted restrictive and qualified views on this matter. One critical element is seditious libel, the idea that the state can be criminally assaulted by speech, the hallmark of closed societies throughout the world, legal historian Harry Calvin observes. A society that tolerates laws against seditious libel is not free, whatever its other virtues. In late 17th century England, men were castrated, disemboweled, quartered, and beheaded for the crime of seditious libel. Throughout the 18th century, there is a general consensus that established authority could be maintained only by silencing subversive discussion, and any threat, whether real or imagined, to the good reputation of the government must be barred by force. Leonard Levy. Private men are not judges of their superiors, for this would confound all government, one editor wrote. Truth was no defense. True charges are even more criminal than false ones, because they tend even more to bring authority into disrepute. Treatment of dissident opinion, incidentally, follows a similar model in our more libertarian era. False and ridiculous charges are no real problem. It is the unconscionable critics who reveal unwanted truths from whom society must be protected. The doctrine of seditious libel was also upheld in the American colonies. The intolerance of dissent during the Revolutionary period is notorious. The leading American libertarian, Thomas Jefferson, agreed that punishment was proper for a traitor in thought, but not in deed, and authorized internment of political suspects. He and the other founders agreed that traitorous or disrespectful words against the authority of the national state or any of its component states was criminal. During the Revolution, Leonard Levy observes, Jefferson, like George Washington, the Adams, and Paine, believed that there could be no toleration for serious differences of political opinion on the issue of independence. No acceptable alternative to complete submission to the patriot cause. Everywhere there was unlimited liberty to praise it, none to criticize it. At the outset of the Revolution, the Continental Congress urged the states to enact legislation to prevent the people from being deceived and drawn into erroneous opinion. It was not until the Jeffersonians were themselves subjected to repressive measures in the late 1790s that they developed a body of more libertarian thought for self-protection, reversing course, however, when they gained power themselves. Until World War I, there was only a slender basis for freedom of speech in the United States, and it was not until 1964 that the law of seditious libel was struck down by the Supreme Court. In 1969, the Supreme Court finally protected speech apart from incitement to imminent lawless action. 2 centuries after the Revolution, the Supreme Court at last adopted the position that had been advocated in 1776 by Jeremy Bentham, who argued that a free government must permit malcontents to communicate their sentiments, concert their plans, and practice every mode of opposition short of actual revolt before the executive power can be legally justified in disturbing them. The 1969 Supreme Court decision formulated a libertarian standard, which I believe is unique in the world. In Canada, for example, people are still in prison for promulgating false news, recognized as a crime in 1275 to protect the king. In Europe, the situation is still more primitive. France is a striking case because of the dramatic contrast between the self-congratulatory rhetoric and repressive practice so common as to pass unnoticed. England has only limited protection for freedom of speech and even tolerates such a disgrace as a law of blasphemy. The reaction to the Salman Rushdie affair, most dramatically on the part of self-styled conservatives, was particularly noteworthy. Salman Rushdie was charged with seditious libel and blasphemy in the courts, but the High Court ruled that the law of blasphemy extended only to Christianity, not to Islam, and the only verbal attack against Her Majesty or Her Majesty's government or some other institution of the state counts as seditious libel. Thus, the court upheld a fundamental doctrine of the Ayatollah Khomeini, Joseph Stalin, and Goebbels, and other opponents of freedom, while recognizing that the English law protects only domestic power from criticism. Doubtless many would agree with Conor Cruise O'Brien, who, when Minister for Post and Telegraphs in Ireland, amended the Broadcasting Authority Act to permit the authority to refuse to broadcast any matter that, in the judgment of the minister, would tend to undermine the authority of the state. We should also bear in mind that the right to freedom of speech in the United States was not established by the First Amendment to the Constitution, but only through dedicated efforts over a long period by the labor movement, the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 1960s, and other popular forces. James Madison pointed out that a parchment barrier will never suffice to prevent tyranny. Rights are not established by words, but won and sustained by struggle. It is also worth recalling that victories for freedom of speech are often won in defense of the most depraved and horrendous views. The 1969 Supreme Court decision was in defense of the Ku Klux Klan from prosecution after a meeting with hooded figures, guns, and a burning cross, calling for burying the bleeps and sending the Jews back to Israel. With regard to freedom of expression, there are basically two positions. You defend it vigorously for views you hate, or you reject it in favor of Stalinist, fascist standards. Whether the instinct for freedom is real or not, we do not know. If it is, history teaches that it can be dulled, but is yet to be killed. The courage and dedication of people struggling for freedom and their willingness to confront extreme state terror and violence are often remarkable. There's been a slow growth of consciousness over many years, and goals have been achieved that were considered utopian or scarcely contemplated in earlier eras. An inveterate optimist can point to this record and express the hope that with a new decade, and soon a new century, humanity may be able to overcome some of its social maladies. Others might draw a different lesson from recent history. It is hard to see rational grounds for affirming one or the other perspective. As in the case of many of the natural beliefs that guide our lives, we can do no better than to choose according to our intuition and hopes. The consequences of such a choice are not obscure. By denying the instinct for freedom, we will only prove that humans are a lethal mutation, an evolutionary dead end. By nurturing it, if it is real, we may find ways to deal with dreadful human tragedies and problems that are awesome in scale.